Korean Mafia Boss called his black wife. Too dark for his family, then his son chose her over him. Park Hyun-soo, the night manager of the Banyan Tree Club in Namsan, would tell the Internal Review afterward that he had served Chairman Cha Sang-hyuk 41 times in 11 years and had never once seen the man hesitate before walking into a room he owned. That night, the 17th of November, at 11 minutes past 9, Chairman Cha stopped in the corridor outside the private banquet hall on the 4th floor and waited a count of 3 before the bronze door was drawn open for him. Hyun-soo, holding a tray of Hueo 41 in cut crystal, would remember the count because he had been taught 22 years earlier at his first hotel in Sokcho that the difference between a guest and the man who owns the building is exactly 3 seconds of unearned silence. Chairman Cha, that night, took the silence the way a diver takes the last breath before the water closes. Inside the hall, there were 147 guests, 2 former cabinet ministers, the chairman of a mid-tier construction conglomerate whose name does not need to be written here, 3 prosecutors who would, by the end of the week, deny ever having attended, the senior priest of a Jongno temple who had blessed the Cha family's ancestral tablets every spring for 30 years, the leadership council of the Daegun Brotherhood, seated in the order of their induction, oldest first, the way it had been done since 1979. And at the head of the long lacquered table, beneath a single calligraphy scroll, on which an old hand had brushed the character for endurance, sat the chairman's mother, 79 years old, 5'2", wearing the same jade hairpin she had been wearing the day her husband was buried. The boy stood beside his father, 21 years old, 6'1". He had his mother's mouth and his mother's stillness and his father's hands, and he was wearing a black wool suit that had been measured 3 weeks earlier in a tailor's shop in Cheongdam-dong, in the same chair where the chairman himself had been measured 40 years before. His name, on the program printed in 2 languages and bound in raw silk, was Chajun Oluwase. The English transliteration of his middle name had been set in a smaller font at the request of the chairman's mother, who had not spoken her grandson's middle name aloud in 20 years. It would later be confirmed by 3 separate witnesses and 1 recovered audio file that the first warning came at 9:47, when the boy turned toward his father and said, in a voice low enough that only the men at the first table heard, that he wanted the microphone before the announcement. The chairman, who had built an empire of 17 registered companies and 4 unregistered ones, who had survived 2 prosecutorial investigations and 1 assassination attempt outside a sauna in Yongsan in the spring of 14 years ago, who had been called Hoe Jangnim by his lieutenants and Sajangnim by his bankers, and nothing at all by his wife for the last 11 years and 7 months, looked at his son and gave the small nod of a man who believes he is granting a favor. He did not see, because he was not in the habit of looking, that his son's right hand was closed around something flat and rectangular and dark, and that the boy had not let go of that object since the car arrived at the gate. The object was a cassette tape. The cassette tape of a small Sony handheld recorder his mother had carried in her handbag for 11 years. Inside it, recorded on a single afternoon in the spring of a year the chairman had since trained himself to misremember, were 43 seconds of his own voice. To understand what was about to happen in that room, you have to go back 11 years and 7 months. To a house in Pyeongchang-dong with a stone wall the color of old ash, where a woman named Aderonke Toluwanise Cha Born Aderonke Toluwanise Adekunle in Ibadan in the long summer of 1979, raised in Lagos and London, and finally in a graduate library at the University of Chicago, where a Korean economics student with sad eyes had once asked her in careful English whether the seat across from her was taken, was preparing the table for her mother-in-law's 70th birthday. She had cooked for 3 days. Doenjang jjigae with anchovy broth, the way the Halmioni had taught her in the first year of the marriage, when the old woman still allowed herself to teach. Galbijim braised for 9 hours in pear and soy. 3 kinds of jeon arranged on a single brass plate. Teokguk, because the Halmioni had said once, in passing, that she liked the broth her own mother used to make. Aderonke had learned that broth from a video posted by a Halmioni in Gangneung, and she had learned the Korean name for each ingredient from a small green notebook she had kept since the 7th month of her engagement, and she had learned, by the time she was 34, to set a Korean table in the order of the cardinal directions: fish to the east, meat to the west, the red of the apple set at the south corner of the ancestral memory she was not, strictly, permitted to share. Her son was 9 years old that spring. He spoke Korean to his grandmother in the soft, slightly old-fashioned register the Halmioni preferred. He spoke Yoruba to his mother in the kitchen. He spoke English at school in Yongsan. And once, at a 100-day rice ceremony for a cousin in Bukchon, he had recited a 4-line poem in 3 languages without being asked, and the chairman had watched his son's small mouth shape the syllables, and had felt, for the length of one exhalation, that the world he had built was a world worth dying for. That had been the spring before the afternoon of the recording. The afternoon of the recording was a Saturday in April. The chairman had come home from a lunch at the Shilla Seoul with 2 of his cousins, and the wife of a textile heir who had, over 14 patient months, made a small project out of mentioning Aderonke's name in rooms where Aderonke was not. The cousins had been drinking. The chairman had been drinking less, but not by much. The boy was upstairs doing arithmetic. Aderonke was in the kitchen finishing the broth. The recorder was in her handbag because she had been recording the Halmioni's voice that week for a project the boy was preparing for school, a small audio collage of his grandmother telling the story of how she had walked from Sinuiju to Seoul in the winter of 1953, carrying a younger brother who would later become the boy's great-uncle. The recorder had been left running by accident. Aderonke, when she found the file 3 days later in the lining of the bag, would listen to it once, alone, in the laundry room, with the door closed, and she would not cry, and she would not delete it, and she would carry that small cassette in a zippered inner pocket of every handbag she owned for the next 11 years. On the recording, the cousins were laughing. The chairman's voice, slightly slurred, slightly performing, said the sentence the boy had memorized by the time he was 12 and had practiced reading aloud in the dark in the apartment in Mapo on the night of his 16th birthday, until he could say it without his hand moving. Maybe they're right. She's too dark for this family anyway. I don't know what I was thinking. The boy, at least, came out lighter. Then the laughter. Then a glass being set down. Then the chairman's voice again, quieter, almost apologetic, saying that, of course he loved her, of course she was the mother of his son, of course, of course. But in this country, in this family, one had to be realistic. One had to think about the boy's future. One had to think about what the elders would say at the ancestral rites. The recording was 43 seconds long. Aderonke listened to it once. Then she put it back in the bag, and she finished the broth, and she set the table for the birthday. And on the morning of the 11th of May, after the Halmioni had eaten and the photographs had been taken, and the boy had been kissed on the forehead by a great-aunt who had never once said his middle name, Adironke packed 2 suitcases and a small green notebook and a brass kettle and her son's favorite blanket, and she walked out of the house in Pyeongchang-dong, and she did not return. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for the apartment in Hanam. She did not ask for her name on any of the 17 companies. She filed for separation in a small office at the Mapo-gu courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon in June, with a lawyer named Yoon Ji-hye, who had once represented a domestic worker from Quezon City against a deputy minister and had won. She signed her name in 3 languages. She paid the filing fee in cash, and she walked out into a light rain on Mapodero and bought her son a cone of soft-serve ice cream from a vending truck parked outside Exit 4. This is what the chairman did not know, because he had never thought to ask, and because the men around him had spent 11 years insulating him from the knowing. Adironke held a doctorate in development economics from a university whose name appeared on the curricula vitae of 3 of his own board members. She had been offered, the autumn before the marriage, a senior position at the African Development Bank in Abidjan. She had turned it down because she had believed, in the way that intelligent women sometimes believe of intelligent men, that the sadness in his eyes was a wound she could keep clean. In the 11 years after she left, she built a small consultancy out of the 2-bedroom apartment in Mapo, microfinance advisory for cooperatives in Lagos, Accra, Dakar. Quiet work, honest work. She did not put his name on her business cards. She did not put her own on the door. Her clients found her by referral, the way the chairman's clients had once found him. By the boy's 14th year, she was earning enough to send him to a school in Yongsan that taught in English in the morning and Korean in the afternoon. By his 17th year, she had bought the apartment outright, in her own name, with money she had earned with her own hands, and she had framed the deed and hung it above the rice cooker in the kitchen, not as a trophy, but as a quiet, daily reminder for the boy of what the inside of a sovereign life looked like. If you are already feeling this, pause, take a breath, and hit subscribe to KR Mafia Boss. Tap the bell so the next chapter finds you the moment it drops. What is about to happen in the next 20 minutes will break your understanding of loyalty in 4 places and rebuild it with something colder, sharper, and far more human than what you walked in with. Stay. You are going to want to be in the room for what comes next. And when it is over, tell me one thing in the comments. Would you have made the same choice he did? The chairman, in the years after she left, had told himself a story he could survive. The story was that she had been overwhelmed, that she had been homesick, that she had been, in some small way that did not require him to interrogate himself, unsuited. He had told the story so often, in so many rooms, that by the 7th year, he had begun to believe it. By the 9th year, his cousins had begun to repeat it back to him as fact. By the 11th year, the Halmioni had stopped mentioning Adironke entirely, and the chairman had mistaken her silence for absolution. The boy was the one variable he could not solve. Birthday cards returned unopened. Phone calls answered briefly in monosyllables. A graduation in the spring of 2 years earlier that the chairman had attended without invitation, sitting in the back row of the auditorium in a black suit, watching his son cross the stage and shake the headmaster's hand and search the crowd once for a face that was not the chairman's. The chairman had left before the recessional. He had told his driver, on the way back to Pyeongchang-dong, that the boy was at the difficult age. The driver, who had a son of his own, had said nothing. What the chairman did not know What no one in that banquet hall on the 17th of November knew, except for the boy and the woman who had raised him, and a lawyer in Mapo whose name had not yet been spoken aloud in the chairman's hearing, was that the cousin who had laughed loudest at the kitchen table 11 years earlier, the one whose voice was clearest on the recording, the one who had spent the decade after Aderonque's departure positioning himself as the chairman's most trusted counselor on family matters, was seated that night 3 chairs to the chairman's left, drinking the same Hueyo 41, smiling at the boy with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent 11 years preparing to inherit what the boy was about to refuse. The ceremony began at 9:51. The chairman spoke first. He spoke for 11 minutes. He named the Brotherhood. He named the dead. He named, in the careful old order, the lieutenants who had built the Daegun Group from a single warehouse in Incheon in the autumn of 1991 into the constellation of legitimate and not quite legitimate enterprises that now generated, by the most conservative internal estimate, 470 billion won a year. He thanked his mother. He did not name his wife. He did not name the absence of his wife. He turned, at the end, to his son, and he said the sentence he had rehearsed in the back of the car on the way to Namsan. Tonight I introduce to all of you the man who will, in the fullness of time and with the blessing of this family, carry what we have built into the next generation. My son, Cha-Jun. He did not say the middle name. The boy stepped to the microphone. He did not smile. He did not bow. He looked, for one slow count, at the cousin 3 seats to his father's left, and then he looked at his grandmother, and then he looked at the back of the hall, where a woman in a charcoal gray wool coat had just been shown to a chair by Park Hyun-soo, who had received that afternoon a single instruction by encrypted message and had been paid nothing for following it because the instruction had come from a lawyer named Yoon Ji-hee, who had once, long ago, helped his sister. The boy spoke for 9 minutes. He spoke in Korean. He used the formal register his grandmother preferred. He thanked the guests for coming. He thanked the Brotherhood for the inheritance they were offering. Then he said, in a voice that did not rise and did not fall, that before he could accept or refuse such an inheritance, the room deserved to hear 43 seconds of audio that had been recorded in a kitchen in Pyeongchang-dong on a Saturday afternoon 11 years and 7 months earlier. He did not play the recording. He had decided, in the apartment in Mapo 2 nights before, with his mother sitting at the table sipping barley tea gone cold, that he would not play it. To play it would be to ask the room to judge his father in his father's own voice. And the boy had decided, somewhere between the 7th and the 8th year of his mother's quiet life, that his father was not worth the sound of his own ruin. Instead, he recited the sentence from memory. He recited it in Korean. Then he recited it in English. Then, for the Halmione, who was watching him with the stillness of a woman who had walked from Sinwiju in the winter of 1953, he recited it in the careful old register of the family's home dialect, the one his grandmother had taught him in the kitchen when he was 6, the one she had never taught his father, because his father had not asked. Then he said the first of 7 sentences that would be clipped, before sunrise, onto 1,000 small, dark screens. My mother was never too dark for this family. This family was too small for my mother. The hall did not erupt. That is the lie people tell about rooms like this. Rooms like this do not erupt. Rooms like this go very, very still, in the particular way that a room of powerful men goes still when one of them realizes, before the others, that the floor beneath his chair has been replaced, sometime in the last 11 years, with something thinner than he had assumed. The chairman's right hand closed around the rim of his glass until the knuckles went the color of old paper. The cousin 3 seats to his left set down his own glass very carefully, as if the glass had become, in the last 40 seconds, evidence. The Halmione, 79 years old, 5'2", the jade hairpin still set behind her ear, did something no one in the room had ever seen her do at a public function. She stood up. She stood up the slow, careful way an old woman stands when her knees are not what they were. And she did not look at her son, and she did not look at her grandson, and she walked at her own pace, the length of the lacquered table, and she stopped at the back of the hall, in front of the woman in the charcoal gray wool coat, and she bowed. Not 15 degrees, not 30, 45. Aderonke, sovereign from the first sentence of this story to the last, did not return the bow. She inclined her head the precise 8 degrees a daughter-in-law owes a mother-in-law in the presence of witnesses, and she said in Korean, so quiet only, the Halmione and the boy and Park Hyun-soo and a single prosecutor in the second row could hear, that the broth, the night of the 70th birthday, had been made with anchovies from Namhai, the way her mother had taught her. The Halmione, weeping without sound, said that she had known. She had always known. What happened next did not happen in front of the cameras. The cameras, by an arrangement that had been made in writing 11 days earlier between Yoon Ji-hai and the hotel's general counsel, had been switched at the moment the boy began to speak, to a closed internal feed accessible only to a private server in an office on the 4th floor of a building in Mapo. The press in the front row had filmed what they could on their phones. What they had filmed was enough. By midnight, the clip would be on 3 platforms in 2 languages. By 6 in the morning, the cousin 3 seats to the chairman's left would have resigned from the boards of 2 companies. By noon, a former cabinet minister would have stopped answering his phone. But the part that mattered, the part the algorithm could not see, happened in a small private office on the same floor. 41 minutes later, when the chairman, having stepped out of the hall under the pretext of a phone call, opened the door and found his wife and his son and a lawyer named Yoon Ji-hyo sitting at a low table with 3 cups of barley tea, none of which had been poured for him. There was no shouting. The chairman had spent the long walk down the corridor preparing to shout, and the absence of an audience had emptied the shouting out of him before he opened the door. He sat down. The lawyer did not stand. The boy did not look up. Aderonke, holding her cup of barley tea in both hands, the way a person holds a cup of barley tea when there is nothing left in the room to fear, looked at her husband for the first time in 11 years and 7 months. She spoke for 9 minutes. She spoke in English because she had decided, somewhere on the walk from the elevator to the office, that the language of the marriage had been Korean, and the language of the leaving would be English, and that he would have to listen to her in the tongue she had given up a career in Abidjan to learn around the edges of. There were 3 things, she said. There were always going to be 3 things. The first thing was transactional. Yoon Ji-hai slid across the low table a document of 47 pages, prepared over the course of 14 months, listing in exact won amounts the value of the marital estate that the chairman had, over 11 years, quietly moved into the names of his cousins. The document had been built from records subpoenaed under a civil filing in the Seoul Family Court, case number 2024-GA-HAP-47119, and cross-referenced with disclosures the Financial Supervisory Service had made available under a procedural request filed in the spring. The number at the bottom of the document, in black ink, was 31,400,000,001. Adironke said she did not want the number. She wanted, instead, the apartment in Hanum transferred clean to a foundation she had registered 11 days earlier under the name of the boy's great-grandmother, the one who had walked from Sinuiju. The foundation's stated purpose was microfinance for women in 3 cities in West Africa. The chairman would sign the transfer that night. He would sign it in the presence of the lawyer. He would sign it in blue ink with the Mont Blanc 149 he had carried in his inside pocket since the autumn his father had died. The second thing was conditional. There was a recording. The recording had a copy. The copy had a copy. If the chairman moved in any way against the boy's mother, or against the foundation, or against the lawyer, or against the night manager Park Hyun-soo, whose sister had once been helped, the recording would be delivered, intact, to a journalist at a quiet investigative outlet in Seongbuk-dong, whose name the chairman would recognize. If the chairman did nothing, the recording would never be heard outside the 4 walls of the apartment in Mapo. Adironke did not want him destroyed. She wanted him still. She wanted him to live the rest of his life knowing that the leash she held was made of his own voice, and that she would never, if he behaved, pull it. The third thing was unspoken. The boy did not look up. The boy did not need to. The third thing was that the chairman would not, for the rest of his natural life, appear at any function, public or private, at which the boy or his mother was present, unless invited in writing, by the boy, in his own hand. The chairman might, in time, earn such an invitation. The boy did not promise it. The boy did not refuse it. The chairman, hearing the silence where the promise should have been, understood that he had been given the only thing his money had never been able to buy. A door that was not locked. A door that was not open. A door whose handle was, for the first time in his life, not in his hand. He signed the transfer. He used the Mont Blanc. His signature, which had closed deals worth 100 times the value of the Hanum apartment, came out slightly smaller than usual, slightly thinner, as if the hand that had built the 17 companies had finally understood that there were rooms in which a signature was not a weapon, but a confession. When it was done, Adironke stood up. She did not extend her hand. She did not look at him. She walked to the door, and she paused, and she said in Korean, because the language of the leaving had, in the last 9 minutes, decided itself to be the language of both endings, that the broth she had cooked for his mother's 70th birthday had taken 9 hours. Then she walked out. The boy followed her. At the door he stopped, and he turned, and he looked at his father for the length of one exhalation, and he said the second of the 7 sentences. He said it in Korean. He said it quietly. Abeoji, you did not lose me 11 years ago. You lost me 43 seconds ago, when I realized you did not even remember saying it. Then he closed the door. In the months that followed, the chairman became a different kind of man, but not in the way the films would have it. He did not become humble. He did not become kind. He became, instead, careful. On day 11 after the 17th of November, he resigned the chairmanship of 2 of the 17 registered companies and transferred his signing authority on the offshore accounts in Singapore to a trustee chosen by the family lawyer. An old man in Jongno, who had not approved of the cousin 3 seats to his left and had been waiting for 11 years and 7 months to say so. On day 23, he sold the Patek Philippe Calatrava he had worn since his own father's funeral and donated the proceeds, 94 million won, anonymously, to the foundation in the boy's great-grandmother's name. The lawyer in Mapo accepted the donation in writing and asked no questions, because the lawyer in Mapo had been in the room and understood that some apologies are paid in one and witnessed by no one. On day 41, the chairman drove himself, for the first time in 19 years, to a small cafe with 42 seats in Mapo, 3 streets from the apartment Adironke had bought with her own hands. He did not go in. He sat in the car. He watched, through the window, his son order a coffee from a paper sachet, the way the boy had learned to drink coffee from a halmioni in Gangneung when he was small. The boy did not see him. The chairman sat in the car for 1 hour and 11 minutes, and then he drove home, and he did not return the following Wednesday, because he had understood in that parked car on the 3rd Street in Mapo that the right to sit at that table was not a right his money could buy, and not a right his patience could earn. It was a right his son alone could give him, and his son, for now, was not giving it. The cousin 3 seats to his left did not survive the winter in the professional sense. The Supreme Prosecutor's Office opened a preliminary inquiry on the 14th of January into a series of wire transfers from 2014 that had passed briefly through an account in the cousin's wife's maiden name. The cousin, by the end of February, had moved his family to a small island off the southern coast and had stopped, in any meaningful way, being in the room. The halmioni, on the morning of the new year, in the small hours when the household was still asleep, came down to the kitchen and made teokguk for one. She set the bowl at the place at the table that had been her daughter-in-law's 11 years and 7 months earlier, and she sat across from the empty seat, and she ate, slowly, the broth she had not been able to teach herself to make the way Adironke had made it. Then she walked, at her own pace, to the cabinet by the door, and she took down a small box she had not opened in 11 years, and she removed from it a letter she had written in the spring of the year Adironke left and had never sent. She put the letter into a fresh envelope. She addressed it, in her own hand, to the apartment in Mapo. She gave it to the driver. The driver delivered it that afternoon. Adironke read the letter once. She did not show it to her son. She placed it in the zippered inner pocket of the handbag where, for 11 years and 7 months, she had carried the small cassette tape. The tape, by then, had been placed in a safe deposit box at a bank in Yongno, in the name of the foundation, where it would remain, untouched and unplayed, for the rest of the chairman's life. The boy did not become heir to the empire. He had said so on the 17th of November, in a sentence the algorithm would replay 9 million times before the snow melted. He enrolled, in the spring semester, in a master's program in development economics at a university in Geneva, the same field his mother had studied in the long summer of 1979 in Ibadan. And he did not take his father's surname off his passport, because his mother had asked him once, in the kitchen in Mapo over a bowl of doenjang jjigae, made with anchovies from Namhae, not to. The name, she said, was not the father. The name, she said, was the boy. The name, she said, would mean, by the time the boy was finished with it, something the father had never managed to make it mean. The chairman, in the last week of March, on a Wednesday at 6:47 in the evening, received in the mail at the house in Pyeongchang-dong a single photograph. There was no return address. The photograph was small, 4 inches by 6, printed on matte paper. It showed his son and his ex-wife and the halmioni, seated at a low table at the apartment in Mapo, eating tteokguk from 3 bowls of different sizes. The halmioni was laughing. The boy was holding his grandmother's hand. Adironke was looking at the camera, not smiling, not unsmiling, sovereign as she had been from the first sentence of this story. On the back of the photograph, in 3 languages, in the boy's handwriting, was a single caption. In Korean, Eomeonie Jari. In English, my mother's place. In Yoruba, Ibujoko Iyami. The chairman stood in the entryway of the house in Pyeongchang-dong, holding the photograph for a long time. His right hand did not close around it. His knuckles did not go the color of old paper. He walked, slowly, to the study, and he placed the photograph on the desk beneath the calligraphy scroll that read, "Endurance." And he sat down in the chair his father had sat in, and he understood, for the first time in his 61 years, that the empire he had been built around an absence he had himself created, and that the absence had, in his absence, become a presence, and that the presence was, and would always be, sovereign and elsewhere, and not his. He did not weep. He poured himself a glass of barley tea from a jug in the small refrigerator beneath the desk. He drank it cold. He sat in the chair until the room went dark, and he did not turn on the lamp because the dark, that night, was the only mercy the room was offering him. And he had learned, in the last 4 months, to accept mercies he had not earned. A boy buries his enemy and pours himself a drink. A man buries the part of himself that thought he had any enemies worth burying, and pours the drink for someone else, and lives, for the rest of his life, with the knowledge that the someone else is no longer in the room. If you were Cha Sang-hyuk on the night of the 17th of November, with the recording 43 seconds long, and the lawyer in the room and the wife you had not seen in 11 years holding a cup of barley tea that had gone cold, would you have signed the transfer in blue ink the way he did? Or would you have walked back into the banquet hall and tried, one more time, to save the empire? Tell me in the comments. I want to know which one you are, because the algorithm already knows which one I am. And I think, by minute 23, it knows which one you are, too. Subscribe to KR Mafia Boss. Ring the bell. Stay for the next one. Some men inherit empires. Some men inherit the silence their fathers left behind. The lucky ones learn, before the dark comes down, which of the two is worth the wait.